Okay, so what I want to do is I want to enhance the grain of this wood, and there's a bunch of different ways that you can do it. And I've tried just about every technique, and I found that it really depends on the kind of wood that you're using. This particular top wood is red elm, which I book matched, and red elm has a really cool grain pattern in it. It's very similar to ash, slightly different, and it has a little bit darker tint to it, but it has that really open pore structure. So what I want to do is I want to enhance that. Now, I could use dye, I could use ink, I could use a tinted grain filler. However, one of the problems I find with using dyes or inks is that when you apply them, they really soak into the wood. And when you go back to sand off the excess, you have to put a lot of effort into it, because even in the areas where you don't want the stain to remain, you have to sand it down pretty aggressively to get it off of there. And sometimes that pulls the dye out of the grain where you want it to remain. So you can also use, as I mentioned, a tinted grain filler. And that can work fairly well too. However, most of the water-based grain fillers that I've found, you end up having to, once you've added the tint, you have to water them down so that they'll actually go into some of the more subtle features of the grain. And so you end up kind of defeating the purpose of using a grain filler when you do that. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to be using, it's an acrylic craft paint. You can get this stuff at any of your hobby crafting stores. And it's a fairly thick paint, but it's essentially a black pigment mixed in with water, and then it has an acrylic resin as a binder. And what that does is it allows the pigment to penetrate into just the pores, and when the water evaporates and the acrylic resin dries, that binds the pigment to the wood. Now on the areas where I don't want it to remain, it just sits on the top of the wood and dries there, so that when I go back and sand it off, it's actually very easy to sand off, but it really stays down inside of the grain where I want it to remain. So it works really well. The other nice advantage to it is once it's down inside those pores, because there's an acrylic resin binder in it, it plugs up the grain in the pores, and that will allow me to add, or when I apply my clear grain filler later on, it won't soak so much into the wood. It'll fill in the grain and sit on the top, so it's kind of like I'm sealing the grain. So the way I do it is just really simple. I just squirt some out on the body, and then I take a rag and I just begin to rub it in. And use a little bit of elbow grease to get it going. Well, I want to be really careful around the edges, because I don't want this stuff to drip down the sides. I just want it to be right on the top. Okay, so now I'm sanding off the excess black, leaving it just inside the grain. And I'm using a random orbital sheet sander. I like to do most of my sanding by hand, but for some of this more tedious work, I'll go ahead and use one of my random orbital sanders. But these sanders take a certain technique to do it right. I've noticed when I watch YouTube videos, guys are doing this, or they're digging down in there, and that's just not how you use these sanders. If you've ever had a lot of experience with these, you'll notice that oftentimes they can leave little curly-Q scratches in the surface. And that happens from moving the sander too quickly or putting too much weight on it. So what I do is I just let the weight of the sander do the work, and then I just very slowly move it over the surface. Because all you have to do is just suddenly move from one side of the guitar body to the other, and you'll leave those curly-Q scratches all over the surface. Of course, it helps to have a good quality sander and really good quality sandpaper. As far as sandpaper, I recommend 3M, Norton, Klingspor, any of those good quality brands. I'm using a Bosch sander, which I like a lot. So, but again, the key is just to let the weight of the sander do the work and then move it very slowly over the surface. Don't get into this, rapid movements or digging with a corner or an edge. That's just not how these sanders are designed to work. So.